All right, people. In this lesson and the next video for the day 11 lesson, it's going to be less calculation based and very vocab heavy. So, as you can see, we've got a handful of vocab terms. I'm going to go through and briefly explain these. You guys know the drill. If you need to pause the video to jot things down, by all means, please do. But what we're going to start seeing is samples and surveys, and how can we select people to kind of survey, and what methods can we use to survey them in an effort to get a very reliable result. So, some vocab out of the way first. Population and sample, we've already discussed this in previous lessons. A population is everybody, and a sample is only a specific portion of that. So typically you're only going to survey a sample because you don't want to survey everybody. So if I wanted to survey or get some input about kind of the feelings of remote learning from all the NEQA students, I'm not going to interview every single NEQA student. Instead, I would take a sample. So maybe I would interview and survey all of my A2 trig kids, but that might not be an accurate representation because I don't have any freshmen or seniors, right? So we have to make sure our sample can be used to make general conclusions about our overall population. So the sample has to be a somewhat accurate or pretty accurate representation of the overall population. Anytime you have a sample where a certain group of people is overrepresented or underrepresented, you create what is called a bias. So a bias is kind of like an unfair leaning one way or the other. And typically that'll happen if you choose your sample group incorrectly, or if you survey them in a way that might kind of influence their decisions one way versus the other. Now, when regards to sampling, or with regards to sampling, we actually see this all the time. And those of you who have taken government might recognize a term called gerrymandering, in which people can draw up borders. So on the next page, I'm going to show you guys kind of how a population can be divvied up into certain samples that could provide bias one way or the other. So here is an example in which we have 50 precincts total, so a little 5 by 10 grid. Clearly, there are more blues than there are red. Okay? So now, if I were to divvy this up and kind of sample, maybe I don't want to sample every single person or every single precinct, I only want to sample one. I could divide it up in such a way that, hey, there's 5, equal districts, it's calling them, or equal groupings. But the way that I've divvied it up, it shows that blue is winning in every single one, right? Which in this case is kind of an accurate representation. But if I got creative with the way that I drew these, I could divvy it out into 5 equally sized districts, right? So each one of these have the same number of grid squares. However, in 1, 2, 3 of these, the reds outnumber the blues, and these two, the blues, would have more. So depending on how you create your sample can drastically influence the outcomes of your survey. And even in Illinois, we have kind of very bizarrely drawn district lines. So this right here, this is the district that I personally am a part of, that I live in. But there are some very strangely shaped congressional districts, even in our state of Illinois. All right, so now let's get into vocab. So the different types of sampling. So this is how you get the people that you're going to survey. The first one, and probably in my opinion the best, is just straight up random. So you have everyone in the population and you're kind of randomly choosing people. You're picking names out of a hat using a random number generator. There's absolutely no rhyme or reason behind this. You're just randomly selecting people. The next type is called systematic. And that's where it's still kind of random, but there's almost a method to your madness. So what you're going to do is you're going to take the population, you're going to order them in some way, shape, or form, and then you are going to select from that in regular intervals. So an example here is you put all the names in alphabetical order and just say you're going to select every 5th person. If I wanted to survey my students, I could put everyone in order of height and randomly select every 3rd student. So systematic has a system behind it, right? There's a kind of a method to the madness there. Next up is convenience sampling, and this is one of the worst. Convenience sample is when you just choose whoever's available at the time. So an example there would be you've got a survey that you want to conduct, so you just choose the 5 people who are close to you and then call it a day from there. That is not at all a reliable sample. So that is kind of the lazy person sampling there. Next up is stratified, and I should mention the following two people tend to get confused. So I'm going to do my best to create an example to help clarify. Stratified is when you create different groups. So you're going to group the population somehow. And then within each group, you are going to randomly select 3 or 4 or 5 or 17 people from each group. So if I wanted to survey NEQA students, I could use the groupings of class year, right? So I'd have freshmen, sophomores, juniors, seniors. And what I could say is, I'm going to survey 10 people from each class. So that way I've got 10 random people from each group, but I still have everyone kind of somewhat accurately being represented as far as all class periods are concerned. Next up is cluster. So cluster says you're still going to divide the population into groups, just like stratified, but instead of taking just a few people from each, you're going to take one entire or two entire groups. So this one might be, I've got, let's say lunch periods, right? I've got 5th, 4th, 6th, 7th hour lunch periods. Each one of those lunch periods has freshmen and juniors and sophomores and seniors. I could just randomly select 5th hour lunch, and that would be my cluster. That would still have representation from all groups. And then lastly, this is another bad one, is self-selected. So you only select people who volunteer for the survey. So you only choose people who go out of their way to participate. So this one is typically not going to be very reliable either, because people who volunteer for surveys, either there might be some sort of incentive where you see people like, hey, you'll get a free $10 gift card if you take a survey, or they might have a very strong bias one way or the other. All right, so here's my example to kind of clarify between stratified versus cluster. And to do this, I'm going to use NFL teams. You could use any sports team you want, it doesn't matter. So a stratified method would be you have all these different groups, right? Each team is a group. And from each team, I want to select one running back, one quarterback, 2 linemen, 2 wide receivers, 1 cornerback, and 1 linebacker. So I'm doing that from every single team. I've got a good mix of offensive and defensive guys, maybe some older, some younger players, whatever. Cluster would be, all right, the NFL is grouped into those separate teams. And if I wanted to get a cluster, I would just randomly survey an entire team. So within that team, that one single team, I would have people from all different positions. I'd have people all different ages. So that would be a difference between stratified and cluster. In both, you're splitting the population into groups. Stratified, you take some people from all of the groups. Cluster, you take all of the people from one or some of the groups. All right, so let's see some examples, see if we can go through it. Large university wants to conduct a focus group of on-campus satisfaction. Here we have descriptions of sampling, plans that the university might use, identify the sample design. All right. We have a dorm in which there are 10 floors. The university randomly selects all of the residents from 2 floors. So we are selecting all of the residents from some of the floors. We're selecting all from some. What did I just do? Try that again. That would be cluster. University gets a list of full-time students enrolled at the university. A random sample of 20 names is selected from each class. So we are taking, ooh, that is a terrible highlighting. We're taking 20 people from each. That would be stratified, right? Because each different group is called a strata, has representation there. 10 resident assistants, RAs, were recruited and asked to find 10 students from the residence halls to participate in the focus group. Typically, this probably wouldn't be a very reliable method, right? Because they're probably just going to find the first 10 kids willing to do this. So that would be a convenience sampling method. A poster hung in the student union inviting students to participate with the promise of free food. There's an incentive, there's an incentive, there's an incentive. By the way, when you guys get to college, if you have a meeting and you want people to show up, promising free food is just about the only way to do it. I'd recommend pizza. That would be self-select. All right, so now we have an example in which a school dance committee conducts a survey to find what types of music the students would like to hear at the next dance. And we want to know which method is least likely to result in a biased sample. Let's see, call 20% of the people in the senior class directory. That's only involving seniors, so that might be biased. Interview every 10th student as they enter the school. So if we're going every 10th person, that sounds like that would be kind of a systematic, although there's really no way that we're ordering the people entering the school. Ask every 5th person leaving a school orchestra concert. Well, this would also be kind of systematic, but if they're leaving an orchestra concert, then they might have a certain preference of music. Set up a jazz website where students list their favorite songs. Well, if it's a jazz website, you might only be attracting certain preferences. So the least biased way to do this would be option B. Would be B. Fun. All right, next up, a newspaper wants to find out what percent of the city population favors a tax increase to raise money for local parks. What is the sampling method used for each situation? Identify the bias, if any. So maybe there is no bias, maybe there is. We got to find out. All right, a newspaper article on the increase invites readers to express their opinions. So they're inviting readers to express their opinions on the paper's website. This would be self-selected. People are choosing whether or not they want to partake. So they might have a bias because they, depending on who visits that website, they might have a certain lean one way or the other. So certain viewpoints might be over or under represented. This also brings up another good point. If they're against the tax hike, they might campaign to get friends and neighbors to visit the site. Good. Next, a reporter interviews people leaving the largest park. Well, if they're at a park, right, and we're raising money for local parks, I'm kind of leaning towards the fact that they're probably pretty big fans of parks. Not only that, this would be a convenience style, right? They're only choosing the people close to them. So it's kind of a lazy person sampling method. And like I said before, since it's near a park, they're probably going to overrepresent the people who are in favor of the tax increase. Next one, a survey service calls every 50th listing. So a very systematic approach because we're calling in regular intervals. Now, there might be some bias here is with regard to people who are versus aren't listed and people who might or might not pay property taxes. So I realize phone books might be a thing of the past, but if you kind of think to back in the, let's say, the late 90s, early 2000s, right? People had yellow pages or phone books. And if you didn't own a house with a landline, your name was not in the phone book. So if you were a renter without a landline, you didn't show up. However, you'd still be paying property taxes, not really get a say. All right, so like I said, this one is very, very heavily focused on our vocab. So please make sure you know how to distinguish between our different sampling techniques. And as long as you have those down, you should be good to go. You know the drill, folks. If you have any questions, please, please, please let me know. As always, good luck, have fun, be safe, roll tide.